Welcome to the Truth Be Known podcast, bringing you the objective truth, boldly, candidly, and without apology. Welcome to this week's episode.
Well, welcome back to another episode of the Truth Be Known podcast. I'm Nathaniel Jolly.
And I'm Ekkie Tepsipornchai.
It's funny. I was seeing someone who was listening to our podcast who finally learned how to say your name. So that's still happening.
Yeah, that is. It's I think a lifelong endeavor. I expect to experience that for the rest of my life. People who even have known me for a long time and will sometimes think they can say my last name, and then they'll add an extra syllable in there somewhere or an extra consonant that doesn't belong there. And I'm used to it. It's it's why I tell people you can call me Mr. T. That's fine.
Mr. T. I like it. I like it. So, well, we'll jump into the content here because I think a lot of our listeners don't like all the chit chat stuff. That's okay. We're not chitty chit chat podcast too much. Well, we're continuing in our series on the qualifications of an elder. We're going to cover the next two today. So we're obviously in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Last week, we dealt with not being addicted to wine or being pugnacious or a striker or a brawler. And so we're still in verse 3. So Paul just goes on to say, after not addicted to wine or pugnacious, but considerate, peaceable, free from the love of money. And then he goes on from there. And so today we really want to talk about what it means to be considerate and peaceable. Those terms are interesting in that I think they get either abused on one side or ignored on the other side. Either you have guys who interpret that to basically mean you don't confront anything, you don't call out false teachers, you don't address hard issues that might be uncomfortable for people. So you have kind of that group. And then you have the other group who sort of ignore this, kind of twist what it means, and they'll instantly go to, well, but Jesus turned over the temple, the tables in the temple, and they sort of ignore this. And both of those extremes miss the mark, right? And it's interesting because Paul's just he's just finished saying, not an elder can't be addicted to wine, and he can't be combative, right?
Yeah.
Quick to want to get into physical altercation, that kind of mentality. And basically he just goes from that into the exact opposite, right? So we have a contrast here with the word but. So you shouldn't be pugnacious, but so don't be this. Here are the other things you should be: considerate and peaceable. Just kind of walk us through kind of a general definition. What's the word here mean? When we think of considerate, and then we'll move on to peaceable.
Yeah, the two words have some similarity here, but the first word for considerate, sometimes also translated as gentle, kind, courteous, tolerant, is from the Greek word epiekes. And really, I think those words do a good job of kind of giving you a picture, not insisting. Here's what the BDAG, which is the standard Greek lexicon, the gold standard Greek lexicon, says: not insisting on every right of letter or law or custom. And the synonyms it comes up with, it's yielding, gentle, kind, courteous, tolerant. And so I think those are all good words to kind of consider. And I think one of the reasons why we struggle with this so much is that in our culture today, we don't know how to deal with disagreements. We don't know how to deal with confrontations. And typically when people meet disagreements, they get very upset. They can get very combative. They can get very argumentative. They can get very divisive. They can get very tribal, right? If you don't believe this, then you're not a part of my tribe. You're not a part of my circle. You might not even be a Christian, right? So we want to learn that there's actually a way to be able to maintain composure, to be kind and courteous, and yet still disagree with someone. And look, it takes a lot of work, and especially in today's culture where people are growing more and more entitled, and they are becoming less and less able to resolve conflicts. I remember hearing a story from universities that some of the newer incoming students in the dormitories are bringing their parents to resolve conflicts between roommates, which some of the officials at this particular university was saying we'd never seen that before. But that's what's happening. We're so used to getting our way. We're so used to being affirmed in everything that when we come across something that we don't agree with, it triggers us, and it kind of brings out this anger and this defensiveness that's very unbecoming of a Christian.
Mm.
So this is really fighting against that culture and learning that, look, you've got to be able to stand upon truth. You're going to have to become comfortable with disagreement, and yet do it in a way that does not affect your demeanor, the way you respond to other people. So that would be the gentle and considerate. The second word there, let's see, that was peaceable. Yeah, peaceable. This is the absence of bringing the sword, the absence of battle and warfare. So the two words are very similar. You're
Yeah.
someone who can resolve conflicts without resorting to something that's going to turn ugly, right? And for me as a pastor, as much as possible, and my own mentor Bill Shannon would often quote Romans 12:18 to me, that says, as much as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. So when I'm dealing with conflicts, I try to deal with it in a way that helps to communicate the difficulty and the disagreement without turning it into a situation where this person will never want to talk to me again because of, the ugliness that broke out from that. So, yeah, this is the idea behind these words. It's very important, not just, as we've been mentioning, these characteristics are not just for elders, but we look for them in elders. But these are things that all Christians should strive for.
Yeah, and I think, since we're talking about the qualifications of an elder, I mean, I think, there are a lot of examples. You brought up your mentor, Bill Shannon. I think Harry Walls would be another guy who
Yes. Yes.
demonstrates this well. John MacArthur. I think, again, not nobody worships John MacArthur, but he's such a good
Yeah.
example of he's just a man. He's not on a pedestal. He sins just like everyone else. He struggles with things just like everyone else. He has to overcome the battle of sin day by day, just like everyone else. But he's been a good example of someone who is considerate, patient, gracious, long suffering. And I think probably whether one agreed with his teachings or not,
Right.
if
Yeah.
you look at like little things, just um, like undeniable things, the fact that you never see him attacking back at
Yeah.
people who
Right.
attack him. Right. I
Right.
mean, this is now there's a time to defend yourself. I mean, Paul certainly did. But like his general character is not a vicious one,
Right.
right? It's a very gracious, just kind of move on and do what you're doing kind of thing. And I think you're right. We talk about our society, probably in our circles, we struggle more, in kind of the reformed camp. Now that I mean reformed as a broad camp, we probably mostly struggle with minimizing the necessity of these.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think a lot of it is in order to fight back against the liberalism or the feminism or the social gospel, whatever it is, you have to be just as coarse as they are, just as in your face as they are, kind of mentality. This sort of take no prisoners kind of mentality. And again, I want to be careful because there are times for hard words. There
Yeah.
are times for I mean, um, look at how the times where Jesus confronted the Pharisees. There certainly were those times when it was anything but pleasant.
Yeah.
He certainly did overturn the money changers in the
Hmm.
temple, but we can't separate those instances from the overall teaching of Scripture, and without realizing that Jesus, as the perfect man, never did any of those things out of balance. But we as men tend to be out of balance on one side or the other on just about everything, right? The goal is to stay in the middle of the road, but our sinful natures, which Christ did not have, is always pulling us towards somewhere other than perfect holiness. And so, yeah, we get into this where, so for the pastor, the kind of man that you're looking like, and again, looking for, and again, this isn't perfect because no pastor's perfect. If you find a perfect pastor, you're reading about Jesus, and that's it. He's the only perfect one. But generally speaking, you're looking for a man who, and I would kind of summarize it up. I like in the Reformed pastor Baxter's reading. Baxter has some theological issues, but
Yeah.
that book is phenomenal. The Reformed Pastor, he says this quote in there. He says, "We must bear with many abuses and injuries from those whom we seek to do good." And I think that's kind of the heart of this patience, this considerateness. You're just willing to let things go.
Yeah.
Um, and our society doesn't facilitate that at all. In fact, our society, the whole entitlement, like entitlement
Yeah.
is antithetical to this, like in direct opposition, right? Entitlement says, I'm going to hold on to a wrong that's been done against me until I get what I want.
Yeah.
And I'll continually getting it. Well, that's counterintuitive to Christianity, right? And so I think we often don't do this well, just in our society in general. But you need a pastor who can can graciously let sins against him go. He can forgive them. And I'll just add, if you have a pastor who's continually bringing up wrongs that have been done against him,
Hmm.
by a
Yeah.
particular person or by a group
Yeah.
of people, that would be the opposite of what you're looking for. And so, if you're always bringing up a wrong done against you, I would argue that you haven't truly forgiven. You're keeping a record
Yeah.
of that
Yeah.
wrong, regardless of what you say. If it's constantly coming up, then you're living by a record of wrongs. And so that's not what you want in a pastor.
Yeah. This one, yeah, when you've been wronged, that can be one of the toughest things to get past. Um, the temptation to bring it back up, the temptation to remind people that you've been wronged. You've got to be able to move past that. You use John MacArthur as an example. Let me just share this because obviously I served as an intern on the pastoral staff there for a few years. I served in the prayer room. So in the prayer room, after the main service is over, after John MacArthur is done, in the back area where John MacArthur would normally depart to on his way to the office, and I'm waiting for people that need prayer, and I bring them to a prayer room. But while I'm waiting, I would often see people behind the scenes who are approaching John MacArthur with questions. Some people are asking for money, some people are making various demands and whatnot. And what we often see from John that people criticize him for are really kind of his hard positions. And the hard positions by themselves don't make you guilty of not being peaceable or gentle
Yeah.
or considerate or whatever have you. It just means that he has convictions on the scriptures. But I can tell you behind the scenes, there have been multiple situations where I observed how he has handled situations that I thought to myself, wow, I would not have handled that nearly as gently as he did. One of the most gentle and kind men, if you ever get a chance to meet him behind the scenes, that I've ever seen. So a lot of times people will hear what they hear on the radio or they'll watch a sermon and they'll see him as this kind of cold and legalistic person when behind the scenes, I've seen time and time again, that's not the case at all. Now, when we think about the example of Jesus Christ, yes, he did turn over the tables. Yes, I mean, you look at chapters like Matthew 23, and he's pronouncing woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites. He's calling them out straight. John the Baptist referred to the Pharisees as brood of vipers, right? Who told you to flee from the wrath to come? So you do see hard statements coming from Jesus Christ, coming from John the Baptist, coming from the Apostle Paul and the other apostles. But I would challenge you to look at those instances, and typically when that happens, they're dealing with false religion. They're dealing with those who are perverting the truth. They are dealing with those who are essentially heretics. But on the other hand, you look at a book like Philippians, when Paul talks about those who are proclaiming Christ, but they're seeking to harm him somehow in doing so. And we don't know exactly what was going on. I can imagine these people were perhaps blaming Paul for getting in prison, saying that he did it wrong, he wasn't doing it right. And yet at the same time, they're proclaiming the gospel. And what was Paul's response to that? He didn't take it personal at all. He just said, "In this I rejoice because Christ is proclaimed." Who cares what they're saying about me? Right. So there's a balance that we need to take and think through in terms of why is it that we're being tempted to get upset about something. Now, if the truth of the gospel is being perverted, if the truth of the gospel is being distorted, stand strong and call out those false teachers. But if we're talking about someone that has a secondary disagreement, a tertiary disagreement, but otherwise they seem to teach the Bible, they would affirm the same things that we would affirm, the inerrancy and all that. That's where we have to show a little more grace and say, well, I disagree for these reasons, but we don't need to treat them like they're the Antichrist, right? So this requires, and again, this, what this points back to? This points back to a healthy theology, a healthy theology that's not only understood rightly, but rightly prioritized and rightly applied to our lives. And so that's all crucial. And going back to what happens when you've been wronged. What happens when people have mistreated you and you continue to bring it up? Well, I tell you what, obviously you shouldn't bring it up because, as you mentioned, that's keeping an account of wrongs done against you. But there's also a deeper issue there. There's a heart issue there where you are harboring bitterness in some way. And this happens to all of us. Look, we're all prone to this, to this harboring of bitterness, and people can see it when it comes out. And I tell you that the secret to that the way to deal with that is right in Philippians 4 when Paul says, "Look, I've learned the secret of contentment. I've learned how to be content when I have a lot. I've learned to be content, and how when I have a very little, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me." And it's really to remind yourself of the blessed grace and the richness that we have been given in Christ, both now and in the age to come. And the immense amount of sin that we've been forgiven of. Jesus Christ, you talk about entitlement. People who are entitled, I would go even a step further and say that people who live with entitled mindsets are essentially putting themselves on the throne. They're putting themselves on the throne in the position of judgment when God is the one that holds that spot. And there was only one man who was perfect. There was only one man who never deserved anything negative to be said about him, and that's the God man Jesus Christ. And yet he's the one that went to the cross and paid the penalty, bore the wrath in order to give us forgiveness. And so when we remember that, we ought to remember that to be a disciple of Christ now means that we are stewards of that same kind of grace. We are called upon to forgive others just as Jesus Christ and God the Father forgave us. And when we remind ourselves what we've been forgiven of, it becomes much easier to overlook the offenses that come our way because, in the end, in a temporal sense, it doesn't matter, folks. We're looking forward to the future, the eternal state. We're looking forward to Jesus Christ's return. We're looking forward to the inheritance that we have awaiting us in heaven that is imperishable, undefiled, and will not fade away. What does it matter that we're wronged in some temporal sense? It really doesn't. And when we do that, we allow those things to sidetrack us. We become less effective in the spiritual warfare. We start to hold grudges. And as I often say, a bitter person is not a thankful person. A thankful person is not a bitter person. So put off the bitterness, put on thankfulness, and then and only then does it become from the heart an easier task of overcoming the negative that people say about you or the wrong accusations, the harm that people do. It's a lot easier to overlook and just move past it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, since we're talking about the qualifications of an elder, so one of the things you would want to ask, a man would want to ask himself is, do I have a hard time forgiving and letting go? Right. I mean, just some practical questions that you would want to ask yourself. And if a man is in a stage of his life where, he is, maybe he's not acting out necessarily, but he knows in his heart, that he's holding on to bitterness, that he's prone to that easily, and he hasn't, come to grips with that weakness in his life and start to deal with it, well, then in that way, he wouldn't be qualified yet. It doesn't mean that you can't get to the place where
Right.
you deal with that in your life and you start to allow, the Holy Spirit to reign in that area in your life. But if a man is constantly, holding on, airing grievances, wrongs done against him, then you would want to ask more questions about that. I mean, and here's the reality. I think also, for guys who are in the ministry, we already know this. But for those who might be considering eldership, the reality is as an elder, as a pastor in a church,
Yeah.
elder, bishop, overseer, all the same thing. You are going to live a life of being attacked. I recall reading something sometime back where it was a picture of a pastor with little daggers in his back, and it was kind of a gruesome picture, but it was an accurate representation of what happens. And the picture that I saw, basically the guy was carrying on in his duty shepherding, while he was bleeding from wounds in his back. And I
Yeah.
think it was just meant to depict the reality that you're going to be attacked, you're going to be falsely accused. I think it was Phil Johnson who recently posted something about how difficult it was being a pastor, and he posted, actually, it was that funny clip where an actual sheep herder got knocked down by one of the rams in the middle of the road. The
Oh,
clip is
yeah.
hilarious. You got to watch it. But he posted in the context, trying to make the point that sometimes the sheep fight the shepherd,
Yeah.
sometimes you get stabbed in the back. And so I think this is such a vital qualification, because you've got to be able to look at the people in your church and realize that they need an under shepherd. They need a shepherd.
Yeah.
And if they didn't need a shepherd, then you wouldn't be there.
Right.
And they need a shepherd because they need to be pointed to the person and work of Christ. They need guidance in what it looks like to be holy. And sometimes sheep bite. And so
Yeah.
you have to be okay with that. You can't abuse the sheep because you get bitten. You got to forgive, and move forward. And so, I mean, it's actually a very practical, like a lot of these really, touch the heart of the ministry in that way. And so you've got to be able to, hear things that are untrue about you, even from people maybe in your own church. Hopefully over time that happens less, but you always have goats in with the sheep in a local church.
Yeah.
And you've just got to be able to love them despite that stuff. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't deal with issues, right? If there's backbiting, if there's gossip, obviously you deal with those things. But you have to be willing to let them go, not hold it over the person. Like you can never be the kind of pastor who says, you know what, that person offended me, so I'm not going to give them the time that I know that
Yeah.
they need in this
Mhm.
area.
Yeah.
you know and so, yeah, so I think it's absolutely vital. um any thoughts in terms of, like, if a search committee is looking for a pastor, what are some of the ways you could see if a man is this type of man? Because it's not, yeah, I mean, you don't really wear this on your sleeves as easily
Yeah.
as some of the
Yeah.
others.
Yeah, you need references. You need to talk to people at the church where that person came from, and you know what? We all do this when we provide references. We provide references to the people that we have best relationships with, right? And one of the things that you could do as you're talking to someone, just ask them: are there other people that you recommend I would speak to that can provide me a fuller picture of this candidate or something like that? And sometimes they're going to give you recommendations that were not on the reference list. Talk to those people as well, and recognize, Proverbs 18:17. That's talking about the fact that someone may come to you and they bring a case and you believe it, but then the second person comes and now you realize the other side. You're just hearing testimonies from individuals, but generally speaking, I think a person who is considerate, who is gentle, who is peaceable, that that should come across from those who testify of him. And even those who are his references, you want to ask about, hey, have you seen this person in conflict? Have you seen how this person handles situations where people say things that are not true or were ungracious with them? How did they respond? Right. And if someone has been anywhere long enough, someone's going to have a story to share about that. Right. Now, I want to backtrack for just a moment and just clarify this, because you mentioned something that, again, my mentor Bill Shannon would mention to me as well. Remember that the sheep bite, right? They bite. You'll get a ram that'll come and fight you, and we're talking about actual sheep. We're not even talking about necessarily that this person is a goat or a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? We're talking about actual believers. And then on the flip side, on another kind of flip side, there are times that we have unknowingly wronged someone else, but the response from the person that we have wronged has actually been one of grace. That there's probably things that I've done to wrong people within my church, but they're so gracious that they have overlooked it and haven't even brought it to my attention. Right. So recognize that that's going on as well, that there are some really mature, loving Christians who have chosen to think the best when you've done something that maybe wasn't all the best. So even when I receive a false accusation or I'm slandered for something that I didn't do, on the same token, there may have very well been a gracious Christian who didn't bring up something that I really did do, right? That I haven't confessed or wasn't aware of, or whatever the case may be. So all of this is just, it comes down to humility, recognizing that, hey, we're not perfect. We don't expect others to be perfect. And the more gracious we are with people, the more gracious they will tend to be with us. The harsher we are with people, that the harsher people will be with us, and the less they're going to give us kind of that benefit of the doubt. And I'm not saying to live your life in fear of man. That's not what I'm saying at all. But this is just a general reality, right? If you're dealing with actual sheep and your job is to shepherd the flock, then I think Romans 12:18 makes a whole lot of sense. As much as it depends upon you, be at peace with all men. And that's not even just within the church, but even those who are outside the church. I can voice a disagreement without turning it into a full-fledged battle. If there's a way that I could preserve the dignity of the person that I'm disagreeing with, I will seek to preserve the dignity of the person I'm disagreeing with. And a lot of times people will really appreciate this. Like, so don't just start calling people out in front of a bunch of other people. If you have an issue, deal with it one-on-one, deal with it gently, and deal with it humbly, recognizing that you've made mistakes too, right? So, the opposite error, and you kind of mentioned this, is that we have this kind of pugilistic, everything is a major issue, and I'm not going to take anything, and I'm even going to resort to curse language because that's what Paul did, or that's what Elijah did when he was confronting Ezekiel in his letters. I'm not going to do that either. Um, there are ways to make your stand without being combative in this way. But yeah, going back to your question about the search committees, get as much testimonial as you can, and also ask the person point blank, how have you dealt with conflicts in the past? When people have said negative things about you, what has been your response? And a lot of times you'll find out just in how they respond, if you detect some bitterness in their response, how they characterize that person going forward. Those things are all important. And you mentioned that cartoon with the pastor and daggers in his back. That's just an unfortunate part of living in a fallen world, even inside the church. And those who deal with it well don't make a big deal out of it. You mentioned the testimony of John MacArthur that he rarely, if ever, defends himself. That's another thing I was taught as well. Let others defend you. You don't need to defend yourself. Take it in stride. Seek to still love those people that attack you. And when the time is right, when it's necessary, other people will stand up to defend you. And that's going to mean a whole lot more than you defending yourself, because it goes to show also that you're not preoccupied with yourself, because it's not about you. It's about making much of God, not much of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's good. I mean, again, we're reminded here that this is the character that all believers should have, right? I mean, you go
Yeah.
to Galatians where he talks about the fruit of the spirit, gentleness being one of them, right? And so yeah, in a church where people are living this, right? You find, like you mentioned earlier, guys who are often gracious and overlook whatever small offenses you may have given them, intentionally or unintentionally, hopefully unintentionally.
Yeah.
But we all do that, and so yeah, I think those are good ways that a search committee could talk to the man. I think we have to be careful if we're just reading writings. And I'm just
Yeah.
thinking of how easy it is on short form social media to read in tone that's not there.
Mhm.
And so I would even, recommend in that process, I mean, you should be listening to the man's teaching or sermons. I mean, you
Sure.
can glean a lot of that from there, while realizing, right, that a man, while he's preaching, needs to be dogmatic,
Yeah.
because he's standing up there saying, "This is what the Lord is saying," and you can say things in a more blunt way from the pulpit than you might, one on one. I mean, Paul does this in his letters, right? I
Yeah.
mean, where he says, "Do you want me to come to you and be harsh, or um, and so we have those kinds of things. All good stuff here. I think moving on from that to peaceable, and we just kind of wrap this up because really this is just the opposite of what Paul has just said. He's
Yeah.
just said not to be pugnacious or a striker or a brawler. Peaceable is exactly the opposite.
Right. Right.
It's someone who does not resort to any kind of violent response quickly, right? They're hesitant to go there. And I think now this is an interesting one because in our current society, I do, and I know you see it too. We see often pastors who give the appearance of almost wanting to fight.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
and maybe
Yeah.
maybe not physically, but it's almost there's a segment in the Christian church who I think they've forgotten gentleness and meekness because there's a side that has taken that too far, and so it's an overreaction,
Yeah.
um, to where in order to get whatever they feel like we should have in society, that they become not peaceable but
Right.
combative, combative with the lost,
Yeah.
combative even sometimes with other believers. You made a
Yeah.
good point, when we're thinking of doctrinal issues that just aren't worth creating any division over. And I
Yeah.
think eschatology is one of those.
Mhm.
Generally speaking, unless a man is combative about his eschatology is, I know it's been on the minds of people a lot in the last years. That always happens when there's something major going on in in
Sure.
the society. But in all honesty, whether you're pre-mill or amill or historic or post mill, you should be able to be in the same church and that never cause friction with
Yeah.
one another. If it does, then you don't get it. You're not understanding. Well, one, you're not understanding just the character and nature of Christ, right? So there are those second or third tier issues that shouldn't create friction between us. The Presbyterian doctrine, the unbiblical doctrine of paedobaptism,
Yeah.
um, you know, um, it's wrong. But I mean, just look at again MacArthur and Sproul. Um, I mean that those are just the two most prominent, I think,
Yeah.
in
Right.
opposition. They even debated each other publicly, and yet they played golf with each other. Or, Dr. Lawson, who was super close to Sproul, was taught by Sproul. Again,
Yeah.
major differences. I mean, the differences are so vast that they couldn't serve in the same local church,
Right.
and yet there was no combative spirit between the two of them. And
Yeah.
so
I think.
you
Yeah, and I think just
jump
to
in there.
interrupt for a moment, that's a great example of something that we should think through theologically and then come up with a conclusion on how to handle it. So there are cults out there that will teach you that you must be baptized in order to be saved, and some that will go as far to say that you must be baptized at their church or within their denomination. And there are some who will teach that when an infant is baptized, it means that infant is saved. All right. Now, those kinds of positions, I would argue, compromise the gospel. And when a person takes that kind of position, I will stand against it. I will stand against it strongly. Now, the Presbyterian doctrine of paedo baptism does not believe that infants are saved by that baptism. They see that as a sign of the covenant, much like circumcision. Now, how you make that connection, that's where I would disagree. But where they would agree with us, at least in terms of those who are Reformed Presbyterian, those who are conservative Presbyterian, that we would still agree that really the way of salvation comes through the gospel. It comes through believing, putting your faith into Jesus Christ, into repenting. And that is why John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul can play golf together and be buddies, because on the most important matters when it comes to the gospel, they are in lockstep. All right. Really, it becomes a question of, okay, what does baptism signify? Who does it apply to? When should it be taken? Those kinds of things, they're important enough to define a denomination, to define what the church believes in, a local church, I mean, but it's not important enough to divide, because it is not a gospel issue unless someone is saying that baptism somehow communicates that you are saved, meaning it's required for salvation, or it's proof that you're not saved if you don't get baptized. That's when it becomes an issue, or when it's limited in its scope to say that you must be baptized at this church, or if the gospel belief is ignored altogether and it's made all about just go through this rite of passage and you're saved. The Roman Catholic Church sees it as a way of that always communicates grace. It's a means of providing grace, ongoing grace that a person needs as they're going to go through life. They're going to commit sins that they will categorize as mortal or venial sins. And depending upon the sins, they need a certain amount of grace or a certain type of penance that needs to be done. That's when it gets into perverting the gospel. So it starts with the gospel. Is the gospel being perverted? If the gospel is not, then it does not require the kind of response that it would if you were defending the actual truth of the gospel.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I think again, so peaceable, we got to know the difference between um, trying to be at peace, as much as is possible with all men, and the difference between that and the fact that a biblical elder is also going to be one who dogmatically defends the gospel, who will
Yeah.
even, attack false teachers to
Yeah.
protect his flock, and that does not negate his peaceableness.
Right.
If you just think about it this way, a parent, someone who does everything they can to be at peace with men, and yet if someone were to endanger his child, right? I mean, he's not trying to make buddies with the guy. He's protecting his kid, and that's the
Yeah.
right way to do it. And so
Right.
we can't like dissect it that way. And I know that there's huge segments of the church who would almost take peaceable to mean passive.
Right. And that's,
Uh,
yeah, that's not what it means either.
yeah, and I think I mean one good example, and whom I love and I glean a lot from his work. I think John Piper leans in that direction. He's a
Mhm.
little bit more of a pacifist than I think Scripture teaches us to be. He's certainly a man who seeks to be peaceable, but I don't think you can conflate those two things. And so we're
Yeah.
not talking about a passive man who never defends, who never gets
Right.
angry.
Right.
I think if a pastor never gets angry, there's a problem, because there should be a righteous indignation, a righteous anger against those things that would seek to come into the church and harm God's people.
Yeah.
And so we have both of those things, and we don't want to, assume that a man who confronts hard doctrines or false teachers isn't peaceable. That's not what this is talking about. You need both of those things.
Yeah. So a question might be, how do we know we've gone too far? Because we obviously don't want to be what's often termed as milk toast, right? We don't want to be a doormat. where anyone and everyone can just kind of walk all over us. And I would say this: at the point that you do not stand upon truth, at the point that you do not speak truth, at the point that you do not defend what you're supposed to defend, you have gone too far. This is about your demeanor, but it is not meant to compromise your stand upon the truth and your need to defend the flock or your family, whoever it may be. You still have a responsibility. You can do those things without doing it the way the world does it.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I think it was Spurgeon, right, who said something to the effect of the shepherd has two voices, one for the wolves and one for the
Oh,
sheep.
right, right. Yeah,
I think that was Spurgeon. And yeah, the point is, the man knows where to direct his peaceableness and where to direct his anger. You don't
yeah,
make peace with a false teacher. You expose them. I mean, all throughout these pastoral epistles, in fact, in every single epistle in the Bible, most explicitly, but at the very least implicitly, every single epistle addresses the need to confront false doctrine or beware of false doctrine. And it's one of the primary functions of an elder is
yeah.
to guard against those things, which is why he has to be able to teach, right?
Right,
Because he has to be
right.
able to refute doctrine while simultaneously teaching sound doctrine. And so, yeah. Any last thoughts? You want to wrap us up with some final thoughts here, and then
Yeah,
we'll be.
you mentioned Harry Walls, and Harry Walls is a great example. In fact, I just saw a post that he's in Tennessee. He's going to be joining the church where Johnny Artavanis is. Fantastic addition there. And I know Harry Walls from seminary. He taught the last class that I took on pastoral ministries. And I remember the very first day he's looking around, and most of us are in our final year. It's a final class. We're candidating, and he asked all the seminarians, how many of you are candidating? And I would say 80% of the class kind of raised their hand. And he said to them, he said, wherever you go, men, you need to make a determination in your heart that whatever place you agree to go to, that you're willing to be there for life. And that was from the very get go. He showed us what a man with a heart of a shepherd and a pastor looks and sounds like. And I remember later he was talking about he wasn't specific, but he did say that every mistake that he has made in terms of dealing with the flock, every single mistake that he has made could be traced back to the fact that he was too harsh. Not that he was compromising truth, but
Mhm.
that he was too harsh. And I took that to heart. And I think we all should. And again, these are not just, as you mentioned, these are not just for elders. These are for all of us. Have a gentle spirit, have a peaceable spirit, but also have a convicted spirit that seeks to do what God has called us to do and does not compromise upon the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we have to realize that as society becomes more aggressive and anti Christian, this is going to be harder
Yeah.
because it's far easier to respond in like fashion
Yeah.
than it is to respond in a way that just sort of takes it on the chin at times. You can't take that too far. You've got to know where the line is.
Right.
But, the apostles are great examples. Go through and just read. There were times when they were very confrontive in their words, and there were times where they just accepted the abuse.
Yeah.
Um, and the apostles weren't divine. I mean, they were
Yeah.
just men,
Yeah.
just like we are, and they
Hmm.
didn't always get it right, and we won't either. But the general character of a man, you want to at least know that he understands that this is the aim is to not be contentious, to be peaceable, to make
Yeah.
peace wherever
Right.
possible. And yeah, and I think that's the best you can ask for, right? Is someone who understands that and is working
Right.
towards that,
Right.
because no one's going to get it right all the time. So,
Amen.
well, guys, I hope that this episode has been helpful to you. I think this has been a shorter one. We'll see. It's still probably 40 minutes. I don't have a clock, but we're getting near the end here of our series.
Yeah.
And the next series we're going to do, speaking of, peaceable and voices for the wolves, is a 10-part series on false teachers. And so if you're listening to this episode and there are particular popular false teachers who have huge inroads into the Christian world today, and you would like to hear them covered as to why they're false teachers, what they teach incorrectly, what the Bible has to say, send us an email. The email will be in the show notes. We want to cover guys that would be helpful for you to cover. We're not going to cover guys like Kenneth Copeland, some of those guys that are very popular. We'll try to cover guys who maybe are a little bit more subtle. So we will go through this and then we'll get to that and fight the battles we need to fight there. So hope that this has been helpful to you guys. Until next time, let the truth be known.
The Truth Be Known podcast is a theologically driven, gospel-centered program serving the body of Christ by bringing biblical truth to bear on issues facing the church today. Subscribe to the Truth Be Known podcast by using the podcast app on your Apple or Android device, or listen online at strivingforeternity.org in the podcast section.